So I don't want to tell you how to set up Dagger or what dependency injection work. I want to more give you like the idea about the whole thing and how would we approach this if we would not have Dagger. And then I want to show you that there's actually much more out there than just Dagger. And why should we consider something else than Dagger? What's wrong with Dagger? Actually, there's nothing wrong with it. So let's just broaden our view like for the next 45 minutes and forget about Dagger itself. So I was told, always tell a story in a talk. So let's start. Once upon a time, there was like an activity. This activity was really simple. It didn't do anything, it just had like a layout. But this activity needed to do something. It needs to implement support tracking, like the most boring thing we have to do as a developer. And here's where the whole story starts, because it's like a story about testability. We just had a talk about unit testing here, right? So dependency injection is one of the most critical things to like have like testable code. So testability is the main part here. So what do we need in this story? We need a tracker. So it would be probably an interface like this. We need an implementation of that tracker. Let's say we use Google Analytics. So that would implement that tracker somehow. We don't have to care. So let's start how we probably would implement this in the first place. So our activity would have just do new Google Analytics tracker, right? And then we would call track started on the create method. Like super simple, right? But we have a problem here when we look back to this new Google Analytics tracker. How would you test this? You cannot test this because there's one big problem here. It's this. So there's this voice in the dark telling us inversion of control. So your activity should not create any kind of objects. It's not the idea of this activity or most of your classes to create other classes. So this is the whole idea behind inversion of control. Let someone else do this work. So this is our problem with testing. If we had something else, but we don't have Dagger right now, we could test this. So the most simple approach is let's start with a factory. So we would write something like this. Like call the class dependencies, make it like a singleton thing, and then provide one method. Actually, if you have a work with Dagger, it looks kind of similar, right? One method that provides you with an implementation of a tracker. How would we use this? We would call dependencies, get instance, get tracker, something like this. The usage is the same as before, so we just changed the first part. So can we test this? Let's think about it. We need to mock our tracker. And then we somehow need to mock this singleton class that we just created. And then tell, hey, whenever we need the tracker, return the mock. And then we would have one test method that verifies that the activity calls track started. So what do you think about this factory approach? Like the most simple thing we could write, right? It's somehow testable. So, I mean, when you think about it, we somehow had to make the singleton, to overwrite the singleton to a mock, which was a bit ugly because if you look closely, what I did is just having the field instance visible for my test. It's not very dynamic, so we have like created a lot of methods to provide us everything. In general, it's a lot of code, right? So let's think about, without any fancy framework, can we make this better? Let's use a map. So we could write something like this. So we would create like a hash map, and then we would put the implementations that we need in this map. So whenever someone needs a tracker, we would bind this to a Google Analytics tracker. And actually, the whole class would have been one method. There would be a get that is use some nice generics to just return us this class. Might look weird, but just look at how we use it. We would just call get and then the tracker.class. This is pretty nice, much less code. The test itself didn't even change. So this thing, I think, it's much better. It's better testable, it is dynamic because we fill this map. But there's one problem. We fill the map basically on startup time with all the instances. So we probably don't need most of them all the time. So this basically delays our startup, so we don't want to have something like this. But there were some frameworks who worked similar like this. So let's introduce reflection. Reflection is cool, right? Not completely, but let's give it a try. So how would we change this? We would use the same map as before, but instead of having the new Google Analytics tracker, we would just put in a class. And then our get method somehow, the get method somehow needs to instantiate this Google Analytics tracker. But let's look at like a theoretical Google Analytics tracker implementation. What is if this one has like 3 different constructors? Which one do we call, right? With our reflective new instance call. We need to mark this, one of them. How about this? Put like an add inject there. What is this thing? We've seen it, right? We've used it all the time. Actually, it's this. So it comes from an JSR 33 package. You get it with Dagger and all the other ones because they all use the same. It is basically those 3 lines. It's an interface as an annotation that you can put into method constructors and fields. That's what is behind this add inject that you use all the time. So we take this and mark our constructor, and then we can write this whole get thing with reflection. So let's do it. So first we will take this class and ask for all the constructors that are in there. Then we would walk over those constructors and find the one with the add inject. So it would be like this, a declared annotation, get inject. Then we need all the parameters of that constructor. Walk over this and basically call recursive this method to also find all the constructors for those. It looks a bit weird, but it's actually pretty simple. Take a class, find the right constructor, get all the parameters, find those constructors, and instantiate them. And in the end, in our test, if we would write this, it would look the same as before, but with a much more generic approach. And we could have the same test as all of them. So the test, the usage is always the same, right? So let's look at this approach. It is super testable. We can just replace in the map whatever we want. It is pretty dynamic. It is flexible. But the question is, can we improve that? Because there's one thing that we still use this get tracker thing here, right? Which when we use, think about how we use something like Dagger. We use it differently, right? What we want is this. So how we get to this point? Actually, what we always have to write is something like this. Hey, this class needs to fill in those fields. So we call this add inject, this inject method on whatever framework we use. So let's build the same thing. So this inject, we'll take the instance, get all the fields that this class has. So we will walk over the fields, find all the ones that has an inject annotation, and fill them by calling again our nice method that we created. So it's the same thing as like a 4-line thing to fill our class. So what did we just do? I think we just built something like Juice, or we call it Roboguice. It was there before there was Dagger. Maybe some people know it. I mean, I oversimplified here a bit, and the code that I showed, it is working. I'll show you later the repo. But some things weren't there in Roboguice in the first place, but it's basically like this. So this was our activity, right? We have inject, we have the add inject field annotation. We call inject and we use it. There's one problem with this whole approach and that Roboguice had. It's reflection. So actually, until March this year, you could find this on the Google documentation of Android. It says don't use dependency injection frameworks. They updated it now. It's not there anymore, but you can still find tickets to update this text. So there were like a lot of frameworks a few years ago. It was like Roboguice, there was Spring for Android, there was Android annotations, and all of them had an approach like this. But it was super slow, because reflection Android is much slower than on the JVM. But then at some point, something happened, and we started with those compiler magic. And we had a whole talk about this today. So basically, annotation processing and code generation came together with that guy called Dagger. So a company called Square, we all know it, built Dagger, which basically did the same thing as Roboguice, but on compile time, at least most of it. So what we just built, basically Dagger does the same, but instead of doing it at runtime to finding out all the constructors, basically what it does is, while the compiler runs through all your classes, it would build up this graph and then generate the code out of this. And this is why you need to support them a little bit more than you might need it on Roboguice with some more annotations. So Dagger was there, and at some point Google took over the project and put a whole team on it. So it went from Square to Google. It was called Dagger 2, and this is the end, right? Everybody's happy. Maybe not. So because this year there came at least this new guy. And it's a library that basically tries to challenge Dagger a bit. It's not the only one out there, actually, but it's the one we look at it today. And basically that guy, Toothpick, it says, hey, your boilerplate sucks. And it says, hey, you have no idea how to unit test. So let's look at that guy and compare to Dagger. So let them fight. Let's start with some of the things that you probably use. There's always the thing called a module in Dagger. So let's look at how Dagger builds this. So the module is the thing where you provide basically all the instances. So you always have something like this. It was the same in Dagger 1. There's an add provides. And then, like in the very first approach that we saw in this presentation, you just say, if you need this, here's the instance. And you would annotate this with add module. And then there are like probably two versions, right? And the first version, your base module, your application module, whatever you call it, gets the application. So this is the same thing on Toothpick. It looks very similar. So instead of an annotation, you extend the module. And you do something that we also saw earlier. You basically bind a class to another class. You all see there are different versions of this. So there's also two instance and two singleton and stuff like this. But it's pretty the same thing. So let's add like the next thing that you need in Dagger. It is the component. So the component is the one that you in Dagger where you call the inject. So in your activity, you get the component and you call inject to get the injected fields. So in Dagger, you do this. You say add component. You say this component uses this module. It can be a list. And then for every activity, fragment, service, broadcast receiver, or basically every class that had like field injection, you need to declare one of those. Which is one of the things, if you came from Dagger 1 and moved to Dagger 2, I thought is really annoying that I have to all of a sudden write them all down. So let's look at Toothpick. Next to Toothpick, like what the fuck is a component? Actually, what most of the dependency injection frameworks have in common is they're based on the JSR33, like the Java standard. There was this add inject annotation. And it basically describes how a dependency injection should work so that you can replace one framework with another one. And this JSR doesn't mention components. This is something that Dagger invented. So Toothpick basically say, you know, we give you one method, toothpick.inject, and you give me an object. Similar to actually what Dagger 1 had a bit. So we don't need a component. You can hide it behind your own class, call it dependencies or something. So the setup part, I would give it Toothpick, like 1 star. But you only do this once, right? Let's look how we use this. So that's Dagger, right? Add inject, and then just use it. But you have to set up the whole thing before you use it. So you have to create your component. So in your application, you definitely probably have this. If you have an application class, else you probably have an activity. You use this class that Dagger generated you. Use the call the builder. Set the module to this thing. So remember, we said like annotation, we bind them together, but you have to do it with code as well. And then call build. So you have to create this component class that you call the add inject on, and then use it. So you probably have something like this. So let's look at Toothpick. In Toothpick, you say open scope, let's call it application. You can give it any name you want. And then, similar to what Dagger does, you install the modules. So think about for this for now as like a component. So, and then you can use this. So, and you would use it like this. You would say, hey, open scope, add in, .inject. There's one difference here to Dagger. I don't have to call get application or something to find this thing. So I don't have to keep a reference to this component object, because I give it a key, and Toothpick will find this via the key. So I can use in every fragment activity, I can tell open scope application, as long as I set it up earlier with the install module, I will get the same instance here. So I guess a point on both sides. Pretty much the same, I think. So let's look at the testing part, especially as Toothpick said, hey, testing is a cool thing, and you should take more about this. So let's look at what Google says about Dagger and unit testing. They said, don't use it for unit testing. Actually, all the examples that you find always testing, and Dagger is espresso or something like this. Which is, well, that's basically what it's saying small here. Most of the things you need in your unit tests are simple constructors. That's constructor injection. You just call the constructor. You don't need Dagger for this. But we also have like the activities, the fragments, and if you test this with Roboelectric or without Roboelectric, I have a talk about this tomorrow, you might want to use this. And you want to, at least, you don't want to use this, but you want to test this. And that's all of a sudden there's Dagger in there. So there are different ways how to do this, but people definitely use Dagger testing. So let's look at this. And this is at least what I used in the demo code that I will show you later. So let's see. I would mock my tracker. Then I would create a test module and extend the module that I want to override. And then override this method and return instead of the super one. I just return my mock. There are different ways, and I would be happy to hear how you do it in your unit test. And then we have to set up this component somehow, so to install this test module, so similar as we used it before, and set it somewhere, right? I create like an application.set or whatever, wherever you store this. But in the end, when the activity calls on create, it will ask that thing, right, to inject. So you need something like this. Let's look how I would do this with Toothpick. So Toothpick comes with something like test tools that you might know from Espresso. And what I would say here is, you know, whenever someone asks for the application scope, also check here in this object. It's just an object, the first parameter. Because what this will do is, when someone needs, when the class calls the inject on Toothpick and looks for an instant to get injected, it will first look, when you use this test rule, in this class, if there's something with a mock annotation. So you basically can override whatever was set up before with this, just with a single line. So your test itself, see, there's no setup at all, like set something into the application instance or something, because as I showed you, everything works in Toothpick about the key. So if you use the same, I think it's a mistake, I called it application before, not application scope. So use the same key that you use in your application and just test it. The rule does all the magic for you. So for testing, and really I'm a big unit testing fan, I give this point to Toothpick. But there's one big point where Dagger 2 got really famous, and this were scopes. So you could do scopes, activity scopes with Dagger 1, kind of, but built-in feature came with Dagger 2. So what is this about? One of the cool things in dependency injection is the add singleton, right? So singletons normally have this get instance method or something, and they're hard to test and everything. And all of a sudden, with dependency injection and Dagger, you just mark something and add singleton, and it will be a singleton. You don't have to care how this works, and you don't have to care in your test, because it's just an annotation for your test, no one cares. But there's one problem. So we started marking the classes as singleton, and then we use our application, and a singleton lives like the whole lifetime of the app, right? So you use like like on your first screen when you open the app, maybe a login screen, and you start a couple of singletons, and they will be there the whole life cycle of your app. That's why at some point people say, you know, we need injection, but with a different scope, and only the living scope of the activity. And whatever singleton I will have there, it will only live as long as this activity lives, and then throw away. And it also would allow me, if I would have such an activity scope, to inject an annotation, for example, like in a presenter or something. Normally, you can only inject the application context. So this was the whole idea behind it. So let's look at how Dagger does it. So there is an add scope annotation. Of course, there's one. You need this annotation runtime and give it a name. Activity scope is very common. So this basically defines an annotation. Then you use this annotation on something that is subcomponent. You would say, hey, the subcomponent will have a module, which probably holds like the classes that you want to have in that activity. Again, you need like the inject thing, right, as we know it, because this is a component. Then you would define this module, a scope module. Maybe keep the activity here to get it injected later, right? And if you want to inject this, you need that provides with the activity scope, and you return it. There's like small variations, but basically that's what you do. And then you have to probably go to your application component and make sure there is like something like a plus or so. So you have to also combine them together in some way. There are also different ways here. You know what Toothpick would say here? Fuck, that's annotation porn. This is just like, I don't know how many annotations that we just saw. So let's keep Dagger for a moment. This is how we probably would use it. So in your activity, you would somehow create the scope that we just saw, right? And then keep it. So someone needs to hold on to this scope. And then, for example, if you need it for a fragment, you would maybe build something like this, ask the activity for the scope, or keep it somewhere in your application, or you would have one class that keeps the scope. And Toothpick say, hey, come on, stop all of this. This is like nonsense. Because in the end, what was this? This is basically, this is like the same approach that our application uses, but we keep it in activity instead of the application, but we need like 5 different annotations for the same thing. So let's look how Toothpick does it. So we also would create a new module, a scope module or whatever, extends module like the other one. And you would bind, for example, activity to this instance that you have. So as I said, before we had 2, there's also 2 instances. Just one thing you want to inject. And how would we use it? Actually, the same way as before. So we would call open scope. And actually, this could call activity scope. Someone didn't review my slides well. So, no, forget just what I say, sorry. I start again. So we would call open scopes, and this is how we combine the application scope, sorry I get it wrong, with the activity scope. So for the activity scope, I just use the name of the activity because that's hard to get wrong. But we could also give it a name, activity scope, or I don't know, droidcon Kraków. It's just 2 strings, and this basically says, open that scope, and this one as well, and install this new module. So there are 2 lines to basically create the whole thing. But remember, in Dagger, we had to keep the scope in our activity. No one keeps the scope unless Toothpick. So there's one thing that we have to do. There's a closed scope all of a sudden. So the activity would keep it, and then the garbage collector would clean it up. Here we have an explicit closed scope. That might sound a bit dangerous, but it gives you complete new opportunities. You could think about like a scope, a multi-activity scope all of a sudden. So like imagine a checkout flow that goes over multiple activities. You could create one scope and keep it and inject it in all your activities in this flow until this flow is cancelled or closed by some reason. So then you would call it closed scope, and then all your singletons and all your instances are gone. So this is a really nice approach, I have to say. So I really would give Toothpick this point. But remember when we looked at Roboguice and then came Dagger, the big thing was the performance. So it's definitely a point we need to look at. So the guys that wrote Toothpick, and I was not involved there, they did some tests. And basically, when you have a certain number of injections, which is reasonable for a normal app, this would be the difference. So Toothpick is normally sometimes before Dagger 1, sometimes a little bit slower than Dagger 1, but they're all like in the same region. If you have a really big app, Toothpick is really a bad choice. So Dagger 2 really is the winner if you need a lot of injections. And if you really need a high-performance app, Dagger 2 is the winner overall. So Toothpick is more something to compare to Dagger 1. So that's definitely a point from Dagger. But this is far from what something like Roboguice would have. We would have like hundreds of milliseconds here. So, but there is more that the Toothpick brings you. For example, it comes with something called a smoothie module. It's like another dependency you could add to the Gradle file. It would bring you basically all the things that you need for your Android application from Android itself. So remember all those provides method that you normally write for, I don't know, the telephony manager and all of those classes, right? There are a lot of things that we always repeat. That's why they say, we provide you one module, you can just add it to your application class and you get all the Android classes by default. You can inject all of them. So what is the idea behind Toothpick? So basically the Guice, and it was developed by developers from Groupon that were working on Roboguice before to try to make it for like 1 or 2 years, make it faster, and at a certain point they say, okay, there's nothing we can do anymore the way Roboguice works. So we need something new. And I can tell you this, they didn't get the approval from the managers to write something new, so they did it in their spare time. And they came up after like 2 months with this thing called Toothpick, which brought the things from Roboguice, the ease of use, with something that at least tries to compete with Dagger a bit. So it's somewhere in the middle. And for them, it was a great replacement for Roboguice. But let's compare them with like really pro and cons. So Dagger is much more comprehensive. Remember when I said like this is like annotation porn and everything, and you have to do everything twice? Annotation, component, module, and then in the code, component, module. This is so that you cannot make something wrong. It will tell you if something doesn't match here. Dagger is much more feature-rich. They just added like Android memory callbacks you can add in your application and stuff like this. And it is the most performant dependency injection out there. Although there is one project now from one guy at Google that he open sourced who says it's as fast as Dagger. But Google is not promoting it because actually they didn't want it to open source it. But Dagger is also very heavyweight. It is a top-down approach because in your component you have to say every single activity that will need this. So there's one place basically that knows where you need this. It has this annotation porn, and it's pretty hard on unit testing. So Toothpick tries to be more lightweight. The API is really like basically 2 classes. It is more a bottom-up approach. So no one knows where does all the injects are, right? It's just the activities itself calling the inject. So much less boilerplate with a focus on testing. But it's also not idiot-proof. So you can make a lot of things wrong. Think about this multi-activity scope that I explained to you, right? If you forget to call close scope at some point, you have a problem. You have a memory leak. So if I would probably a really big team and a team of juniors, maybe Toothpick isn't the best choice. And the performance is not as good as Dagger. It's comparable to Dagger 1. So what I wanted to show you here is choose the right tool for your problem. So there's, not sure if you know this, there's something called on Google GitHub, the Android blueprints. And it basically shows you how you can write an application with MVP, with MVVM, with RxJava, with Dagger. There is one, at least on Branch right now, one with Toothpick, just to show you a more lightweight approach. It really check what do you want to solve, what is the needs for the tool, and not just say, dependency injection, Dagger, right? Dagger might be the best choice for a lot of things, but it's not the only thing out there. And there are other tools out there. So all the source code that I showed you, from the factory to the reflection to Dagger to Toothpick, I put in here. I will put the slides online to SlideShare. And with this, so check out Toothpick. It's written by those cool guys. He wrote a lot of open source before, so he's really, really good guys. And I want to say thank you. And now we can open for questions.